delighted to be here to participate in the common cause which brings us together, the struggle against hate, against atrocity, against indifference, against impunity, against injustice. And this is part of the larger struggle for human rights, for human dignity, for justice. As my father of blessed memory taught me before I even understood the profundity of his words as a young boy, when he would say to me that the pursuit of justice is equal to all the other commandments combined. This, as he put it, this is what you should teach onto your children. This should be your life's credo. But as my mother, when listening to my father tell me these words, would then say to me with a profundity that resonates with me to this day, she would say, if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice is simply an abstract notion. Otherwise, it's a theoretical construct. You have to feel the injustice, combat the injustice, act against that injustice. And I suspect because of these early teachings, I then got involved in the two great struggles of the 70s and 80s, the struggle for human rights in the Soviet Union and the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and got involved through the prism of defending political prisoners. The generic approach was that of the mobilization of shame against the human rights violators. In fact, now this is the 35th anniversary of my first involvement in the defense of the then celebrated political prisoner Anatoly Sharansky. Sharansky was the leader of 4 human rights streams in the Soviet Union at the time. The struggle for Soviet Jewry, Helsinki human rights monitors, involved also in the ethnic and religious rights movement, and a spokesperson working with Sakharov in the democracy movement. For these human rights activities, Sharansky was tried in the classic trumped-up charges of sedition and anti-Soviet slander and agitation. But Sakharov, the father of human rights, not only in the Soviet Union and beyond, put it well in summing up Sharansky's involvement as follows. He said, and the Soviet Union's repression of it. He said, the trial of Anatoly Sharansky was the trial of human rights in the Soviet Union. That the Helsinki Final Act was our human rights manifesto. The Soviet Union turned it into a prosecutor's club. And then ending, Sharansky's only crime was to tell the truth and to tell it in English. And so the Soviet Union had to quarantine this advocate for speech, for freedom, for human rights. I developed in the course of that involvement what was then the 10-point advocacy model, which with some refinements has been my guiding framework and narrative to this day. I know if my son were here, he'd say, Dad, you know, it's a new generation. After 2 points, we're gone. We're not listening anymore. But this is a committed audience. Let me just give you, by way of one-liners, this advocacy model. First, the internationalization of that advocacy. Second, legal briefs in and outside the Soviet Union. The purpose here was to unmask and expose the Soviet Union as a violator of its own law, of its own legal system, since it was preoccupied with legitimacy, sought to show its own system and showcase it. The idea was to expose and unmask and delegitimate the Soviet Union in that regard. Third, to take the Helsinki Final Act, the historic agreement, which had been signed then 35 countries, and show that what the Soviet Union was doing was not just a violation of its own laws, not just a violation, though I was serious enough, of the Sharanskys of the Soviet Union, but breaching its obligations and undertakings to each one of the Helsinki Final Act countries, which led to the fourth thing, getting my own country, Canada, one of the architects of the Helsinki Final Act, to be a leader with respect to sanctioning the Soviet Union. The fifth thing was to get parliaments involved, and that was when the Jackson-Vanik Act was enacted in the U.S. Congress, conditioning trade relations with Russia on the whole question of compliance with human rights, something we need more of today. The sixth thing was mobilizing the nascent NGO human rights movement, which of course is so compelling today, but then involving the Helsinki monitoring groups that had grown up in each of the Helsinki Final Act countries, working with our counterpart, Helsinki monitors like Sharansky in the Soviet Union. I just want to point out that the Norwegian Helsinki group was one of the main initiators with respect to this kind of advocacy, involving a critical mass of civil society advocacy, women, students who gave enormous energy to the movement, scientists, trade unionists, the legal community, involving law schools, bar associations, lawyers, and the like. Demonstrations, mass demonstrations at the time, 10,000, 20,000, etc., year after year in every capital, confronting the Soviet Union and its leaders at every turn. And finally, the involvement of the media. One case study. In 1979, when I arrived in the Soviet Union with agreement with them, to plead the case on behalf of Anatoly Sharansky, the day before I was to present the case, I was arrested, detained, expelled. And as I was put onto a Japanese airliner going, fortunately, to London and not to the Far East, the Japanese authorities there wondering what the commotion was all about, I said 2 messages. One, just tell the Canadian embassy, if you can, that I've been expelled, and tell Dan Fisher, then the Moscow correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, that I won't be able to meet him for dinner. Arriving 5 hours later in London, and it's the experience of being expelled, you know, the thing that dominates is that you are worried about those who you left behind, those who may be suffering because of your involvement and the like. And so when I arrived in London, first thing I did, called my wife and said, don't tell anyone. I've just been expelled from the Soviet Union. She says, what do you mean don't tell anyone? It's all over the news. Dan Fisher broke the story. It became front page headlines around the world, and in the true Andy Warhol stratagem, for 15 minutes, I had my 15 minutes of fame. But what that story did was, because of Anatoly Sharansky's celebrity status, my connection with him gave me that kind of public place. When I returned to Canada, the foreign minister held a press conference for me, and Canada at that point, in 1979, suspended all Helsinki agreements with the Soviet Union as a result of that expulsion. A principled move which I believe resonated in the Soviet Union. But I always wondered, Sharansky was released in 1986, some 9 years after our advocacy campaign began. And he was released within a year of Gorbachev ascending to the presidency of the Soviet Union. And I was wondering, what had been Gorbachev's role in all this? And I had occasion in the 90s to meet with Gorbachev. We were on a panel, spoke with him in translation, asked him about the Sharansky case. And he said to me, you know, you may not believe this. He said, I had never heard of Anatoly Sharansky before I came to Canada. He had come to Canada, his first foreign visit as Minister of Agriculture in the early 80s. He said, I'd never heard of this Sharansky. I came to Canada, I came before the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture, and they began asking me questions on Sharansky. I met with government ministers, and they asked me about Sharansky. I left the Canadian Parliament building. There was a massive demonstration with regard to this Sharansky. So I came back to the Soviet Union. He said, I asked for the file, looked at the file, saw that he was, yes, a troublemaker, but certainly not a criminal. And then he added the words, and it was costing us to keep him in prison. In other words, not only the mobilization of shame against the Soviet Union, but making it in their self-interest to release Sharansky. In 1981, and here the two struggles intersect, in 1981 I was in South Africa as part of the anti-apartheid movement. I was invited to give a talk and said I'd like to speak on the topic, if Sharansky, why not Mandela? Mandela at that point was a banned person. You couldn't even mention his name because it would subject you to a criminal act. Spoke on the topic. At the end of the speech, I was arrested, detained, and then at that point, a group of people came over to me, some authorities, and they said, we don't know why, but the foreign minister, Pik Botha, has asked to see you. I went to see Pik Botha, and here a remarkable thing occurred. The remarkable thing was that as I entered into Pik Botha's office, then the foreign minister of South Africa turned to the wall and he said, do you know who that person is? And it was a picture of Anatoly Sharansky. And I said, yes, Sharansky. He said, the reason I called you here, he says, I couldn't understand how somebody like yourself, who represents this great hero, Anatoly Sharansky, who is fighting our enemy, the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, how you could speak of Nelson Mandela, the communist Nelson Mandela, in the same breath as you speak of Sharansky. And I said, well, both Sharansky and Mandela are struggling for the same thing. In one word, freedom. He then went on to try to tell me how apartheid was simply an exercise in democratic pluralism, different peoples living separately but equal and the like. And I then said to him, and with that I close this point, I said, Mr. Boda, I'm going to tell you something that you may not like to hear. I said, yes, the Soviet Union is a major human rights violator, but South Africa is the only post-Nazi government that has institutionalized racism as a matter of law. Apartheid is not just a racist philosophy. It's a racist legal regime. And as long as I can, from wherever I am, I'm going to fight this racist legal regime until it is dismantled. I should tell you that I was in South Africa 2 months ago, called up Pik Botha just to see after all these years, and had a similar conversation, which I won't go into for reasons of time, about the liberation of Nelson Mandela. Again, telling me that at the end of the day, it became in South Africa's self-interest, after the mobilization of advocacy, to liberate Nelson Mandela. After the Soviet Union and the South African advocacy, my daughter, who was then 15, came to me and said, Daddy, face it, you have nothing else to do. You worked for political prisoners in the Soviet Union. Happily, they're out. No thanks to you anyway. You used to drag us to demonstrations when we were kids on behalf of the political prisoners with regard to human rights in the Soviet Union against apartheid in South Africa. Well, Nelson Mandela is out. He's president of South Africa. South Africa is free. Face it, Daddy, you have nothing to do. The whole idea was that I should really return home and be more with my children. And as I then said to her, I said, Gila, I have to tell you, the struggle for freedom is not over. The political prisoners are still there in all parts of the world, animated by the same impulse for freedom. And so in the last decade, my involvement has been with Egypt, first with Professor Saad-Eddin Ibrahim at the beginning of this decade, and then closing it off with Maikel Nabil, a great human rights hero who is sitting here amongst us. I just want to tell you that Maikel Nabil went on a 120-day hunger strike, confronting, the Egyptian post-Mubarak dictatorship, and was freed by that kind of relentless, unwavering moral courage which characterized the men and women, regardless of the political prisoners in whatever country that I represented them. Got involved also with China at the beginning of the decade with a professor, Kunlun Zhang, one of those who was a McGill professor, went back to China, his home, imprisoned for being a Falun Gong practitioner, got involved in his case, and here we have Zhang Li, who will be speaking tomorrow morning, bringing us up to date with regard to Liu Xiaobo. And I was here with Zhang Li in Norway the last time I was here 15 months ago on the occasion of Liu Xiaobo getting a Nobel Peace Prize and sitting there in the audience like you were with that empty chair, symbolizing the fact that Liu Xiaobo could not come to Norway to get his prize, but was imprisoned. And finally, and closing, involving with Iran. What we're witnessing in Iran, there's a lot about the nuclear threat, but I want to say, under the radar screen is a persistent and pervasive assault on human rights in Iran, which is imprisoning the leaders of each of the movements, and even those who are not involved in movements of criminalization of innocence. And so now, in my guise as a parliamentarian, we've developed the Inter-Parliamentary Group for Human Rights in Iran and have set up an Iranian political prisoner defense project to mobilize parliamentarians from all over the world, each of whom are being asked to take up the case of one Iranian political prisoner, to work with a law school, to work with the NGO, and to create a critical mass of advocacy. And so with this, I close. And what I've learned from the political prisoners and their unwavering courage and commitment to freedom, to speak on behalf of those who cannot be heard, to bear witness on behalf of those who cannot testify, to act on behalf of those who are putting not only their livelihood, but their lives on the line, to mobilize shame against the human rights violator. And at the end of the day, as Martin Luther King put it, that the long arc of the universe will bend toward justice, and we will come out of the shadows of oppression into the light of freedom. Thank you.